via a mail-in donation. And we will see you again at 20 minutes after the hour. Welcome back, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce to you our second workshop leader for today, Rev Dr Clayton Smith. He has 25 years of worship leadership as the lead pastor and 13 years as executive pastor of Stewardship and Generosity. He's completed his doctorate studies in preaching and teaching stewardship and generosity. He's the author of Propel, Good Stewardship, Greater Generosity, and co-author of Growing Through Disaster, Tools for Financial and Trauma Recovery in Your Faith Community. Clayton has lots of insights and information to share about enhanced worship and generosity, and especially in this time of pandemic. So Clayton, we welcome you and look forward to your sharing with us today.
Well, thank you, Marcia, and thanks to the Ecumenical Stewardship Center for this opportunity to support the Academy. And thanks to Kevin and the technical team there for making this possible. I want to begin by focusing on this title page, Plan Your Church's COVID-19 Recovery Ministry Now, with the emphasis on now. It's not too soon to plan how you're going to respond to the needs of your religious community, even though we're still dealing with the question, when will we reopen? And this question is also parallels with the question is, when will this pandemic end? Let's take a look at the book that I wrote my first year of retirement. It's called Growing Through Disaster, Tools for Financial and Trauma Recovery in Faith Community. A little later on, I'll share with you why I wrote this book, especially the very first year of my retirement, which was not in my long-range plan, though writing has been one of my key retirement focuses. We all know there are disasters. Take a look at this one in Puerto Rico. My wife and I love this country. We love to visit there. And this is just total devastation. Like the E5 tornado that hit our Missouri area community, Joplin, in 2011. We've learned a lot about disaster and disaster recovery of hurricanes, not only tornadoes and floods. And now we ask the question, how are we going to respond to this pandemic? There are many similarities, divide and conquer when we have a problem. And in dealing with disasters, we talk about three areas: relief, recovery, and long-term restoration. Because as leaders of the church, we lament along with the Psalms, and we cry out to the Lord, when will this end? And what can we do to help people in their time of despair? Let's look at this slide on the impact of this on our community. And of course, we see this in our national media, local media. This is just a devastating picture when we think about these people on life support. I myself had a dear close friend who, in mid-50s, who was dealing with cancer, came down, and she was in the ICU for 7 days and on a ventilator for 5. Thank goodness now she's home and still recovering with her family. So I know it impacts all of us in personal ways as well. The health issues, the spiritual and emotional and psychological issues. And of course, one of the things that we want to talk about is the financial issues about the changing circumstances of our life today. Another reality that maybe we're not focusing on enough is the unemployment and how we can help those unemployed. I remember back in ministry at Church of the Resurrection, we developed a new ministry to help those employed, and people would gather those without jobs, and we'd talk about their needs. We'd support them emotionally and spiritually, because it is a trauma, it is a loss, and we encourage them in developing resumes so that they could move forward, and shared opportunities. We even had some companies call us and let us know of job openings. So unemployment is a real issue. Probably the greatest issue in the church is, in personal life as well, is the financial issue. How are we going to realign our church resources? How are we going to reevaluate our priorities? How do we reach out to our donors and encourage them to continue to give according to their own resources? So the financial dilemma is a very serious part of our future feasibility as an institution as well. Some people are considering moving. Either they have apartments that they rent, or their homes are going to be foreclosed because of this national disaster called COVID-19. We're hopeful that the CARES Act and the stimulus payments will help people. But our question today is, how can local churches help? That's the title of the first chapter in my book, Growing Through Disaster. And we know that pandemic is a human disaster. It's very personal. Number one, as a pastor, I think I've served 4 local churches in my ministry. And one of the things that pastors always begin, either planning sermons or planning pastoral care programs or mission. We want to know what are the felt needs. And I think that's important to gather your staff, develop teams that can ask that question and be sensitive to those that are in need. And also knowing who can help. In other words, this issue is about victims as well as volunteers. And my book deals with both aspects of development. How do we transform crisis into opportunity? Well, most of us would begin about thinking about our mission statement. Everything seems to be changing. Do we change our mission statement? Well, we may need to. I've always believed that the churches that I served would grow if we led with our strengths. What does our local church do well? Especially according to our purpose and our mission statement. And what can our purpose and mission statement say to this pandemic today? But we also have to be realistic. What is our capacity? Is our battery fully charged, half charged, or low in energy and capacity to serve others? So I think that's very, very important for us to consider. Compassion, there's no lack of compassion in our lives. I know most of us really care for people, but there is what we call compassion fatigue. And we need to be sensitive to that even now, to be our best to serve others with greater intensity and find God's glory even in the midst of tragedy. Let's take another look at those who may have needs, those outside our church in our community. Most of us will look at our own local church needs and our own family needs and our own personal needs, but we need to broaden our perspective as we possibly can to reach out to those in our community. You know, when things get tough, the tough get going. Anybody we talk to, we can ask the right questions. Sometimes in natural disasters, we tend to ask the wrong questions. And sometimes these people have been answering that question over and over again. One of the best questions is, what can I do to help you? Not what's your problem or what you're going through, but what can we do to help you? To help others be less anxious. I believe that a pandemic like we're experiencing today calls for us to be alert at all times and ask those who experience trauma and loss to tell us about it. Beware, in many cases, we can do more harm than good. We see that in disaster recovery. Groups go in and do things for people in need without making sure they know the priorities of the people that they are serving. So we know we must serve with much more than good intentions. But knowing the need, diagnosing the need, and helping people grow with faith over their fear through the love of God. Let's take a look at a couple models of disaster recovery models. The one model in particular that I talk about in my book, Growing Through Disaster, is a model of group ministry, small group ministry, developing opportunities for people to come back together in small, safe groups, or to begin right now with developing these groups in online Zoom or Skype meetings. I'm a part of a weekly Zoom meeting of ministry leaders. And of course, we're concerned for the larger church, but the group nurtures each one of us in our particular needs. And we have a closing time of praying for one another and those that we're personally involved in. John Wesley began a great revival in England by the use of class meetings or cell groups. And at one time he had 10,000 of those groups going on as England and the Methodist movement was sparking a great revival. I believe the church has the opportunity to begin to work with people in small group ministries. And we're all hungry for those relationships. My wife Lori and I have been a part of a small group, the same small group, the last 14 years. And we just are really struggling that we cannot get together again, almost as much as we struggle we can't get our family together. So think about how you can develop a small group model that can meet the needs of your congregation. The model that I suggest helps people with dealing with trauma as they voice their feelings. It offers some informed trauma guidelines. It speaks about the financial anxiety. It speaks about spiritual formation and the importance of belonging and how healing happens through the touch of Christ and the movement of God's Spirit in our lives. And small groups also help us bond together in difficult times, bringing something good out of something bad and deepens our fellowship. And as a church, I believe that we do all of this through the eyes of evangelism and discipleship, and growth may result. So how do we get organized? Let's look at the next slide. We call our leaders, and we develop leadership teams. And many church leaders that I've been talking to are reorganizing their church structure to make that happen. It's not business as usual. I think we would make a mistake if we thought it was. So we need leadership teams that can maximize the role of the pastor and the staff and multiply the impact. And you've heard this before in talking about generosity and stewardship ministry, but leadership is the key. I discovered this when I was doing research for my book, and I went to Joplin, where I'd been before in 2011 to help churches in our United Methodist District recover and rebuild. I offered hope and encouragement. That E5 was a total devastation. So I think we need to recognize that we want to have resilience like Joplin has. Matter of fact, they became so resilient after multiple tornadoes that they decided they were going to develop a web page, and it's called Joplin Pays It Forward. If you want to see a great source and great story of inspiration and resilience, go to that web page, Joplin Pays It Forward. What has changed for today? Well, there's a lot of similar patterns in recovery. One of the things we've noticed is that Jesus is cool again. You can talk about Jesus. You can talk about your personal faith. You can interview men of faith and your pastors and priests and religious imams. I think today it calls for the church to make hard decisions and to do that with a sense of urgency. So let's get back to the beginning question. When will recovery action start? Next slide. And what direction will we go? Will we go straight ahead? Will we turn to the right? Or will we turn to the left? Or do we need to go all three directions? What is your direction? Don't be frozen in your fear. Don't be frozen to step forward, not knowing what's ahead. The question we all need to ask ourselves is, will we be resilient? Can we be better for this, or will it make us worse? What is the challenge facing before us? So know your direction. How can we encourage one another? So that's the question. So as leaders in the church, as pastors, who can you draw around you to encourage you in this time of isolation? The question is, will we rush back to the normal? I think that's a big mistake. I think the church has to take action now to be the type of safe place, to be more intentional in its care, and especially in reference to a communication plan. Let's take a look at the next slide. Tools, healing tools. Healing tools for trauma and financial loss. When I decided to write this book, and it's quite a story about how that came to be, and I'll mention that later, I decided I needed a partner in writing. So Matt Shanefield was asked. I'd worked with Matt in stewardship programs. I'd worked with Matt as a coach, financial coach. I'd worked with Matt. He had written many books in the area of financial stewardship training for local churches. He was kind of a Kansas City alternative to Dave Ramsey's program, and he's just a very knowledgeable young man. When I was in ministry at Perkins School of Theology, I was a part of a suicide prevention program. Would spend all night answering hotline phone calls. And the training I received at Perkins in our pastoral care department gave me a template, you might say, for healing. 6 steps that pastors can take. And I memorized that in my seminary days, and it's come back to me many, many times. First step was to make contact. Second was to help focus on what the problem was. The third was to simply cope with these people and their needs, sometimes in practical as well as spiritual ways. To offer hope, not only cope, but hope. And in many cases, people needed referrals and ongoing guidance. So what the book offers is not only in the informed trauma care, but also informed financial recovery. And sometimes this financial loss will need to develop in weekly and monthly and 3-month financial budgeting processes, and also long-term 3 to 5 year recovery terms. The next slide talks about how people are more vulnerable today. And when we're vulnerable, many of us will be more open. Some of us will close our personalities down, and that'll be even more difficult to reach. But because people are vulnerable, and we as pastors were vulnerable, and we're probably open as well, we want a game plan. This book offers one type of game plan that you might consider. If it fits, it'll work well, I believe, because it's practical, it's helpful, and it's hopeful. Some churches will need a roadmap. They'll want to see the destination, plan with the end in mind. And to do that, they'll need listening skills that build trust and encourage one another in many important ways. I was online last night with a group of pastors that we're meeting with. And the pastor group, we're asking the question, how are people being affected by this new virus? In what ways do people feel helpless because of COVID-19? What kinds of fears are coming out? What kinds of losses at different levels they're experiencing? And what are the effects of isolating yourself from other people? I've had people say, well, won't life go on as usual? Well, it'll go on, but unless we're good listeners and share the faith that builds trust and hope, we're going to see people 6 months, 12 months, 18 months have reactions, grief reactions, loss reactions, even physically become ill because of the stress that was not healed. There's a lot of helplessness, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of loss, and most all of us would have to admit that we're all experiencing isolation, especially those of us who are people, persons. The reflection question I lift up in our listening and sharing is, what has been the most difficult part of this pandemic for you? Share that with others and see if you don't get feedback that's encouraging people to tell stories, and telling their stories is very therapeutic. Let's look at some of the biblical benefits and blessings that we can experience. The Bible is obviously God's story, but it's story after story of personal and community crisis in the life of the church and the life of the people of Israel. And we know that we can trust God. Throughout the Bible, I've been looking for more and more scriptures about hope. Matter of fact, the 3rd chapter of this book talks about reigniting hope. It also offers a self-inventory, a scripturally based self-inventory. And I would encourage you to think about what's the most important scripture for you, and let that become a scripture that helps you go through this pandemic. Many people are wondering about online worship and its effectiveness. Well, we know that it's not going to be as effective as a public worship experience. And after this pandemic is over, will we do one or the other or both? I think Scripture would call us to just worship God in many different possible ways as we can to get the gospel message out. But we do need to be situationally aware. Let's look at the next slide. One of the things that I think is dangerous is if we're too general and we paint everybody with the same paintbrush. I think we're challenged to be situationally specific, knowing our context for ministry, as well as being situationally sensitive. Of the 18 pastors here in the Kansas City area that were on the Zoom last night with me, they come from all parts of the Kansas City and have different kinds of needs that we need to be sensitive to. So I would encourage pastors to be specific, to be sensitive, but to start now. Start with online ministry the best you can, and it will continue. Well, I mentioned earlier, I'd tell you why I wrote this book. So let's look at the next slide. It was November, near Thanksgiving of 2017. I was preparing to retire in the next few months. And I noticed one particular stewardship company was working in Texas after Hurricane Harvey had done so much damage through the flooding, especially in the Houston area. And this stewardship company, I won't mention its name, so it's one of the larger stewardship organizations that we have, the many United Methodist churches and other mainline churches use, decided they would offer free financial consultation to any church that would need their help in their time of recovery from that disaster. And I sent a note to the president of that organization, who's been a friend over the years, and I said, "Way to go." And he texted me back, "Everybody's got to do something." And immediately my mind took me back to 2007. I had been down to work on Hurricane Katrina recovery in 2006 and had taken another team. Matter of fact, our team went back 2 years in a row. We were so bonded together by this experience. And during that time, we were helping the family. And one morning I was meeting with them, praying with them, having coffee with them, and I could tell they were upset. And I asked them, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Well, a neighbor 2 doors down, a man in his mid-50s, had evidently taken his life the night before." I said, "Was it financial? Was it, why would that happen?" And they said, we have no idea. On the surface, everything went well, a wonderful family with children. He was in construction, and since the disaster, his business has grown and grown. The only explanation could be that he was working 20 hours a day for the last 2 years, and he must have been using stimulants, and he may have overdosed. And my heart was breaking with these people in this neighborhood, and I thought, we need to offer more help to local churches so that they can help people in the long-term recovery of the church and the people it serves. In my book, I have a quote that really spoke to me, and I'm glad that I was able to capture it. It's from Sylvia Matthews Bureau. It says, while natural disasters capture the headlines and national attention short term, the work of recovery and rebuilding is long term. And one thing we can celebrate about the church oftentimes is the first group in and the last group out of a disaster. And I think that will be true in this situation as well. Let's look at the next slide. This is a word of realistic caution, learning what to do and what not to do. And the simple answer to that is listen well and diagnose the needs of your people. For one, I think most churches and local communities could do well to think about offering more small groups or to emphasize ways that they can support their classes and encourage growth in that area. We want to be the church that listens to the needs of others. We never want to surrender to hope. We want to promote people following personal hygiene, social distancing. And we want to practice good stewardship of our time, our talent, our resources, and especially our witness to help others. Let's go on to see what happens when we do it well. We can experience triumph over tragedy by reigniting the hope that God gives us, the trust that we have. I believe God's strategy for hope is in the cross, the empty cross. It's interesting that this pandemic has been going on through Lent and Eastertide now, and we don't know when the church will come back to open its doors. But now is the time to offer hope that is sustainable. Chapter 3 of my book talks about these tools, and these tools literally are scripture, different scriptures that can reignite hope, the scriptures that can be taught and preached and get living out as an example for others. One of the things I think that is important is recognizing what you need to improve small group culture in your setting. Let's look at the next slide. I'll never forget doing a major capital campaign with Church of the Resurrection. And as executive pastor of Stewardship and Generosity, that was my task. We brought in a national consultant. We went out to lunch with the executive team, and we sat down and were interviewing this consultant. And I said, do you have any questions? And the consultant said to me, yes, my first question is about your small group ministry. How many small groups do you have? And how many small groups do you think you're going to set as a goal? I was totally surprised that the first question this financial stewardship and generosity consultant had to do with small groups. So I'm encouraging you from my ministry experience, having been a pastor over 50 years, the culture of the small group in your church is really essential for not only financial growth and spiritual growth, but for bringing people to become more faithful, dedicated, devoted disciples. We know that people need to do these three things in a small group. They can voice their feelings. We know that people want to help others. And we know that people in small groups will give more to the total mission of the local church. We've seen that over and over. It's proven to be effective in local churches. Let's take a look at John Wesley's model of small groups. John Wesley started a total revival in England. At one time, he had 10,000 small groups. And it was as if he was asking a question, what can I do to bring revival to England and to the people who are not being served by the Church of England? He realized he could start small classes, cell groups, if you will, and that the real transformation would be in that process. Can we as the church grow our church through small groups? I hope so. If you could ask God one question, what would it be? I've been asking myself that question. I think the best question for me today is, how can I best give to others when the crisis is crippling me? In other words, I need to know myself and my own situation, what I can do and what I can't do. And then I can trust God to help me move through my futile efforts, through prayers that seem to be unanswered, through my own limitations, and oftentimes my feeling of isolation. I believe it's tough as a pastor to be isolated from members in the church, not only on worship, but throughout the work of a week. Let's look at the next slide. The path to healing. As I mentioned earlier, there are three phases of dealing with disaster. Of course, the first responders and the early responders, and I've been a first responder and early responder in several different natural disasters. That's where you actually save people's lives and pulling them out of the wreckage and help encourage them in their time of shock. The church, I think, can help best during our initial relief efforts of people dealing with this pandemic through good communication. I think the second path is to recovery, and I've mentioned those 5 steps of healing trauma in the book, and they're pretty essential in what we do and how we do it. As a matter of fact, I might mention them again. First, help people simply cope. Second, help them accept the reality of their loss. Third, help them express their feelings through prayers and laments and telling their stories. Fourth, strengthen their faith. Share with them scripture stories where the things were impossible and yet God provided. And finally, be aware that helping others helps yourself. That is so essential. In my story, that was an important part of my ministry that made a big difference to me and the congregation I was serving. Let's look at financial recovery steps. The Ecumenical Stewardship Center certainly is about helping people personally in their financial recovery, but also helping the church, which will help the denomination, which will help us grow closer to the body of Christ. What we've done, Matt has a chapter on financial assessment, that is taking your financial pulse. My wife and I, for example, have been thinking, what's the impact on our finances? We need to take an assessment at this particular time. And how is that going to impact the future? Not just now, but short-term, long-term. We realized we need to take a look at our budget or our spending plan and how are we going to spend what we do have, and how are we going to monitor that? What will we do? One thing most of us realize, we need to immediately spend less and save more. Well, I hope we realize that. And third, the long-range planning, 3 to 5 years. For most of us, it's going to take 3 to 5 years to get back at our financial and economic level that we have today. For some, less time, for some, more time. But I think in long-range financial planning, you need a perspective, so you begin with the end in mind in your planning. When talking to my university today, we recognized there is a need for financial retention. I've been on last 3 hours this morning, I've been on a conference Zoom call with the Board of Trustees for Central Methodist University. And they've been talking about ways for the university to better serve the students. And they were recognizing the need for a plan called financial retrenchment, which actually means how do we reduce the budget? How do we reduce full-time, part-time staff, reduce clergy, reduce the operating, the mission, and program? These are real questions and need to be handled, but they need to be handled in a very confidential and quiet way, not to spark additional fear or anxiety. But financial planning at all levels is a reality today. Okay, let's look at the next slide. We've got about 3 or 4 more slides. In the book, the first 6 chapters, there are 12 chapters altogether. There are 3 chapters on trauma recovery, and those chapters are simply titled Relief, Recovery, and Restoration. And then the second part of the book is about financial foundations for recovery. That is the assessment, spending plan, and the long-range planning I just mentioned. The third part of the book is 6 small group studies. There's a chapter on victim and volunteer. This book is designed to help everyone, volunteers who want to help and victims who need the help. In many cases, that's an overlapping situation. Chapter 8 is a small group that deals on the 5 tasks of trauma healing. Chapter 9, reigniting hope and love. 10, recovering your financial life. 11, building your money management. And 12, planning for your financial future. The key to this book is not what you learn from it, but how you apply it. And I think these group studies can really make a difference. And I need to be quick to say this may not be the best curriculum for you in your situation, but it's a good model. You can look at it and find content that might even be better. But I'm pretty pleased with the process. Each chapter in this group studies has an agenda for your small group that reinforces the process of telling people what they want to know, and it also has exercises so they can learn to apply it. Also in the book are some additional recovery tools. Let's take a look at the next slide. Thank you, Marcia. In the book, and like most books, it was too long to include all this, so this had to be edited for the publishing company. And we've got information how you develop a guideline for a recovery group. And I did small support groups and recovery groups for 40 years of my ministry. I was an associate pastor, a campus pastor, and then I began being a preaching pastor for the next 25 years. And the last basically 15 years, I've been at Church of the Resurrection. And so I've done a lot of recovery and support groups over those years. It also has community outreach promotion. That is how you do a small group in your church, and how you do it not just for your church members, but how it can be an outreach into the community as an evangelism and discipleship tool. Then there's a good resource called volunteer training resources. So members who go through this process of recovery might in turn want to help others in the future, so they can be a trained volunteer. That was my case. I went through the sudden death of my wife back in 1984, and I eventually went to a recovery group, and that recovery group was so helpful to me, I decided for the next 15 years, I offered a recovery group in the fall and the spring called Growing Through Grief, based on Howard Kleinbell's, who was a United Methodist seminary professor, his model of pastoral care, which was very effective to help me and to help others. The next resource is a training steps for volunteer, who you can contact through your denomination. The next, a sample volunteer covenant, before you take a group or use leaders to make a difference. We want to know what the expectations are, and we want them to sign off on that. Finally, at the end of this 6-week study, there's a sample healing service and celebration. Okay, let's take a look at the closing time that we have here today. We may have some time for questions and answers. I think we will. The book is available on Amazon or Cokesbury, and we hope that you'll consider it as a helpful resource. And I certainly would welcome any feedback. Everything needs to be perfected. And so you may have some ideas can help me make this resource even better. The next slide. And that's the end. Let's go to questions and answers. If you have any, if you're not already eating your lunch.
Thank you, Clayton. If you would like to be seen, I'd remind you to turn your video on. You need to do that. We can't do that for you. And
okay, now I would warn people that I look just like this Benjamin Franklin right here on the screen. So just don't let me shock you when you see me. I haven't been to the barber for some time.
Well, you know, a lot of us haven't. So that's
it
okay.
Says I cannot turn my video on. So maybe Kevin needs to help me.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, I will remind folks. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
In the meantime, I'll remind folks that you can type questions or comments for Clayton in the Q&A box.
If we don't have any questions, I might start telling jokes, bad jokes.
Please, no.
Ken Sloan has heard too many of those. Ken, good to see your face today.
Well, I will start with one, Clayton, while folks are thinking. One of the differences between what we're experiencing now, I think, and some of the other disasters that the church gets involved in is we're kind of all in that disaster space. And I think trying to figure out how we can be helpful when we too are victims of trauma. Do you have any insights about that?
Well, that's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, Ken and I heard that question at a previous webinar. One of the first questions, well, you know, my church, people don't have any needs, and they don't know what to do or how to help. It is different. It is a different type of disaster. I think one of the key differences is the impact that this isolation is having on us personally, and especially from the church perspective, the body of Christ. And I remember as being a pastor back in the 80s, and I invited a university professor who was head of the psychiatric department of Southern Illinois University to come and speak at my church, and I invited the Ministerial Alliance. And he said, you know, we're talking about grief in general. It was Growing Through Grief, not through Growing Through Disaster program for pastors. This had been an area of my study, and I majored in pastoral care in seminary, and my professor, David Switzer, had written a book on the dynamics of grief, which my senior project was to edit his book, which was great. There were 2 or 3 of us doing it. It was just an awesome learning experience. So I had a lot of knowledge in my head. But one thing that this doctor, and I mentioned, his last name was Davidson, I mentioned this in the book. He says, I want you pastors to be aware that 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, people who have gone through some distress, and certainly there's distress from this isolation. I mean, I have distress, not stress. I have distress, and I'm a retired pastor, and I'm helping one particular pastor. I'm consulting and coaching with him now, and he's dealing with this distress. He just can't get up and hardly preach to a video camera when he's used to connecting with people. Well, this psychiatrist said that people will develop internal physical problems, especially in grief, the lack of moisture, the lack of hydration. We all need to hydrate more now than ever before, in my opinion, and I don't do that. I've got a glass right here, and I'm trying to do that more. So there are going to be subtle issues, and there's going to be brokenness in families and marriage relationships. The media talks about children who are in abusive situations. So it's a long term, and the church needs to stand strong, and pastors can support people with the help of a good team. And that's another reason why I love the small group model, caring group, support group model. Long answer, sorry, but.
Oh no, that's good. And we have some questions now. First one is, can you elaborate more or give examples on restoration, reigniting hope on the path to the healing side?
Yes, I can, and I'll make an effort at that. Hope is God's powerful gift of love. And it preaches, it teaches. And so my third chapter is rebuilding our trust in our faith. And it's the story of the cross. God's strategy for the world was hope. Give us hope for eternal life, to give us hope for living love. So one of the first reigniting tools is to trust God. Another is to search for meaning. Matter of fact, the search for meaning is what's important. As I look back in my own personal life, and I look at the tragedy of my family, my parents' death, or I had an uncle that died last week, I try to find meaning. What is their legacy to me? And so finding meaning is about that restoration, to be a better pastor, to be a better husband, to be a better father. I think restoration is waking us up from our slumber of taking God for granted, thinking we're so self-sufficient when we're not. And so I talk about the reigniting tool of asking God for help. And healing is another dimension of this restoration. We think about physical healing and emotional healing. We need, in this pandemic, we're going to need greater spiritual healing for the despair and the hopelessness. Pastors are expressing that to me. So that's how I would answer. This pandemic is so subtle and subliminal. I find myself spending so much more time in prayer and reflection, and sometimes when I say something, I realize, wow, where did that come from?
Thank you. And not only, I mean, another difference between other disasters and this one is, for a natural disaster, I mean, there's lots of time in recovery, but the event itself is short.
Right.
And this event is long. We are still in the event.
Good point.
Yes.
It's compounded. That's what I would call compounded grief and loss, compounded isolation. It's compounded. And that becomes more profound. It's like a child who's growing up and in a growing stage has a medical problem, and their growth spurt stops, and they're never going to recover that which they have lost.
Mm-hmm. Right. Some more questions here. Can you elaborate on small groups? Do they need to be trauma recovery groups, or to be helpful, can they cover a variety of topics that still helps a community recover and restore?
That's a great question. And because while this book focuses on recovery groups, and the 6 chapters are all about recovery, the more I've thought about this pandemic, there probably needs to be 3 or 4 different types of groups, support groups in a local church. For years, I led a men's cancer support group. And every year or so, I would see a shift in the need of different types of cancers and different kinds of dilemmas. So in the life of the church, the last church I served, Church of the Resurrection, we probably had 30 different kinds of support groups, which was phenomenal. Larger churches can do that. But in a smaller, medium church, I think there needs to be at least 2 or 3 different kinds of groups. I think to celebrate Bible study groups now, hopefully those Bible study groups will reflect on this pandemic and the implications for their members. So develop a resource, a one-page resource for all the groups in your church that will help them deal with that. And there's some good resources out there. But I like spiritual growth groups. I like men's groups, women's groups, youth groups. I think breaking larger groups down in groups of 10 or 12 and doing a short-term study. I would think if I was pastoring a church right now, I would lead a six-week preaching sermon series, and I would develop a 1-page or 2-page, nothing complicated, nothing scary to people. And I certainly wouldn't deal with finances at this time. It's just adding insult to injury. But I would offer that small group reflection on the sermon series. They're going to reflect on your sermons anyway. You might as well develop a controlled setting so that it makes a good difference.
Indeed. And I'll preface this to say that I know you were involved in some other meetings earlier today, and in our last workshop, we talked a good bit about engaging younger folks who are engaged on social media, but maybe in ways that the church is not as familiar with. So to preface that, the question is, do you have any resources or recommendations for children and teenagers, situational, specific, and sensitive?
Well, that's a great question. And as an old guy, there is a generation gap there for me. But I do have we do have 2 children who are in their 30s. And they see this reality different than you and I do. They're very skeptical. There's a lot more skepticism. And in many cases, that's healthy. In some cases, like my wife worries all the time about our 31-year-old son when he calls from a party he's attending during this pandemic. Oh, just crazy. But the resources, I don't have, I just honestly don't have a lot of good resources except to say, most of these young people, we have an active young adult ministry, and they are really resourceful. If you get them together, they'll do what best meets their needs. And so I think your young adult pastors and your youth pastors need the support of the general church. So as a pastor now, I would call the young adult pastor and the youth pastor and say, what can we do? What kind of curriculum are we developing? But I would initiate that. I would make that a task group in my local church. Or if I was a district superintendent or judicatory leader, I would say, let's have a training program or a conference to reach those needs. And the conference that I was on today, we were talking about university students at Central Methodist University, and we were surveying their needs. That was one thing that I emphasized. There had been one survey that surveyed the faculty, another survey that surveyed the executive team of the university, and I pressed the fact that what are we doing to survey the students? And if you survey these students now who are off campus back home and ask them questions so they know you're interested, get their feedback and honor that feedback, more of those students are going to come back in the fall if it's opened. And you have students who are athletes at this university, a lot of athletes. So they're wondering about, will the athletic, so our young adults are worried and they're wondering, and we need to develop tools to survey their needs. And then once we know what their needs are, which I probably don't know as well, but I know how to get the team going. So I think there ought to be a team in every church and in denomination as well. Quite frankly, most of our denominations, and this is going to sound a little sour here, are slow to respond on this type of training level. And so we need to get busy, and we need to get busy now, just like we need in the local church now to get busy. Sorry for the preaching that came out.
Now, you can't take that out of the equation if that's your vocation, no. Clayton. I know that we have a lot of folks participating today from smaller churches.
Yes.
And so, if your small group is your whole church, do you have any specific thoughts about how this could be successfully done in a setting like that?
I do. When I was in college, I had four country churches, and they were just wonderful to me. And, very rarely did we have to have business meetings, and the church wasn't complicated in its structure. So I think the flexibility of being in a small congregation, whether it's urban or rural, or whatever diversity it is, has some real advantages. But a pastor or a leader of the church, lay leader or pastor, needs to be more intentional in today. I know that when I was serving the local church and I thought this is a need for them to grow spiritually or grow in their stewardship or whatever, I knew who to go to, what lay person, what lay member, what woman or what man or what young adult I needed to work with, because I knew the church so well and they knew me. And so the flexibility, it was outstanding. And I really enjoyed that compared to being a part of a mega church where it took 12 months to introduce program and start an Ignited program. You can do that in 2 days in a local church. So I would, and you can really have an evangelism impact in a small church in your rural community, especially an urban community, where you can double just by having each person reach one person to be a part of a program, a potluck dinner, something that's inviting you. So I would go for it. Recognize your limitations, but I think the potential of being more relational in a time of pandemic is awesome. I mean, at churches I've attended recently, that they're so big they don't even miss you. So I'm just saying, don't think you can't do it. Think you can, and I think you can do it better.
Wonderful. Thanks for that answer. I'll put a last call for questions.
One of the things, Marcia, I have trouble with isolation about is isolating around the refrigerator. I just can't seem to stay away from it. At 6 foot seems impossible.
That's true. That's true. Well, I see no more questions, Clayton, so I just want to thank you again for your participation today. Great insights that I think are both timely and timeless. As you mentioned, there are disasters happening all the time, sometimes in multiple places, and in multiple ways. We know, as we said, this is a little different because it's lasting longer, but what you shared is applicable not only in this situation, but as we move forward in other ways as well. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for the wonderful work of the Ecumenical Stewardship Center. I think it brings out the best in all of us, so thank you.
Thanks very much. It's my pleasure. So friends, we are going to move into a lunch break at this point, and I was reminded last time that folks may be planning to join us at certain times of the day. So for the rest of the day, we will keep to our schedule, which means that we will be back at 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central, 11:30 Mountain, 9:30 Pacific. I want to thank you again for those of you who have given a break time to support this academy, as well as the whole mission and ministry